The night air over Silver Pine Lake carried that kind of quiet only small towns know, heavy with pine, still as prayer. The moon hung low, silvering the surface of the water, and the only sound was the soft creak of the old dock beneath my feet. I often came out here when I couldn't sleep. Since my husband passed 3 winters ago, the nights had grown longer, emptier. The house was too quiet that night, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes you aware of your own breathing. The clock in the hallway ticked like a heartbeat, and every creak of the floorboards felt louder than it should. I'd spent most of the evening in my husband's old armchair, pretending to read. His blanket still rested over the back of it, folded just the way he liked. 3 winters had passed since he left this world, yet sometimes, when the fire crackled low, I could almost hear his voice, gentle, teasing, saying, "Evie, you worry too much." He always knew when something was stirring inside me. I used to laugh when he said I had the kind of heart that hears thunder before the storm. That night, that saying wouldn't leave my mind. Outside the window, the lake shimmered faintly beneath the half-moon. From here, I could see the reflection of the old birch tree he'd planted the year Daniel was born. Its branches bent toward the water now, tired but unbroken, much like me. I thought about Daniel then, about how quiet he'd become since his father passed, how Sophie had brought laughter back into his life, a warmth I hadn't seen in years. For that, I'd tried to love her, to trust her. But lately there was something I couldn't name. A distance in her eyes, when she thought no one was watching. I pressed my palms together and whispered the same prayer I'd said every night since my husband's funeral. "Please keep our boy safe. I don't need anything else." That evening, I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside, telling myself I just wanted some air. The house behind me glowed faintly. Daniel's car was still gone. He'd been working late again. Sophie said he had another project due. She was always so understanding, always so composed. But that night, something felt off, like the world had tilted a little to one side. As I reached the dock, I saw movement down by the shoreline, a figure, faint in the mist. At first, I thought it was a fisherman. Then I saw the pale glow of a phone screen, and the shape became clearer. It was Sophie, my daughter-in-law. She was wearing her gray coat, the one she saved for Sundays, her hair pulled tight into a bun. And she was dragging something, a large, heavy suitcase. She struggled with it down the slope until it thudded against the planks of the dock. I froze. Every instinct told me to call out, but something in the way she moved stopped me. She looked around, once, twice, scanning the trees, the road, the lake. Her breath came out in white clouds. Then, without a sound, she pushed the suitcase into the water. It splashed, loud and heavy. The ripples spread under the moonlight, widening, fading, and then the lake was calm again. Sophie stood there for a moment, staring into the black water as if it might speak back to her. Then she turned, and for a heartbeat, her face caught the moonlight, pale, tense, almost frightened. She looked older in that light, colder. I stepped back behind the birch tree, my heart pounding so loud I feared she could hear it. I watched her walk quickly up the path, her boots crunching on the gravel. When the front door shut behind her, the silence felt heavier than before. I stood there long after she was gone, eyes fixed on the spot where the ripples had disappeared. There were things in life a mother shouldn't see, moments that steal the peace from your bones. I didn't know what Sophie had thrown into that lake, and I didn't want to believe what my mind whispered. She was family, my son's wife, the woman who brought him laughter after years of loneliness. But the longer I looked at the still surface of the lake, the more I knew that something had changed, something deep beneath our roof, beneath our smiles at Sunday breakfast. The water no longer looked peaceful to me. It looked like it was keeping a secret. And that night, under the pale moon of Silverpine, I realized one thing. Sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest truths. The morning light spilled softly through the kitchen window, brushing across the table where I'd laid out breakfast. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, dark, comforting, familiar. But somehow, it didn't feel the same. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. I heard Sophie before I saw her. The soft tap of her heels on the hardwood floor, her voice humming some tune I didn't recognize. She appeared in the doorway with her hair neatly pinned and her robe tied in a perfect bow, smiling that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning, Mom," she said brightly, pouring herself coffee. Her tone was warm, too warm. I studied her face as she spoke about groceries and errands, about Daniel's long hours and how she might drop by the boutique later. She looked composed, unbothered, not like someone who had stood by the lake at midnight, throwing something heavy into the water. I forced a small smile. "You were up late last night, weren't you?" She froze just for a second, barely noticeable. Then she laughed softly. "I couldn't sleep. I went out to get some air. I do that sometimes." Her answer came too easily. My hands trembled slightly as I buttered the toast. I wanted to ask what she threw, why she went down to the lake. But I couldn't. Not yet. A few minutes later, as she stood by the sink rinsing her cup, I noticed the sleeve of her robe. A faint reddish-brown smear stained the cuff. My breath caught. "Tomato sauce," she said before I could even ask, smiling again. "I was cleaning the fridge last night. Made quite a mess." Her voice was smooth, practiced. But her hands were shaking. Daniel came in soon after, his tie crooked, his hair still damp from the shower. He kissed Sophie on the cheek, then greeted me with that tired half-smile he'd worn ever since his father passed. I watched the two of them together. The way Sophie leaned into him, how Daniel's eyes softened when she laughed. They looked perfect. So perfectly normal that it almost broke my heart. After Daniel left for work, the house fell into that mid-morning stillness again. I stood by the window, watching Sophie in the garden. She was cutting flowers, lilacs and daisies, arranging them in a vase by the porch. But then I saw her stop. She stared out toward the lake for a long moment, her shoulders tense, her lips moving as if she were whispering something to herself. Then, as if remembering I could be watching, she turned back to the flowers and smiled. I stepped away from the window, my chest tightening. All morning, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I had imagined more than I'd seen. Maybe grief had finally made me suspicious of shadows. But when the clock struck noon and I heard the faint hum of Sophie's voice again, cheerful, perfectly composed, I realized something that made my stomach turn cold. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hums while making tea. That night, as I lay awake, the sound of the lake echoed in my mind, soft ripples against the dock, the moonlight on the water. I couldn't stop wondering. What secret was buried beneath that silver surface? And how long before it rose again? I hesitated, gripping the receiver tighter. A few nights ago, I saw my daughter-in-law down by Silverpine Lake. She was disposing of something. A suitcase. And she looked terrified. The line went silent. I could almost hear the hum of the police station through the phone. "Did you confront her?" Liam asked finally. "No," I whispered. "I couldn't. She's my family, Liam. But I can't stop thinking about it. That lake, it's not as still as it looks." He sighed. "Evelyn, you did the right thing calling me. Don't worry, I'll have the team check the area discreetly. You didn't see any identifying marks on the suitcase, did you?" "Black. Large. With a silver lock." My voice faltered. And heavy, very heavy. He promised to call me once they'd looked into it. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up, hands trembling. That evening, Sophie came home unusually cheerful. She brought flowers and talked about redecorating the guest room. I nodded and smiled, but every word felt hollow. Then, as she reached across the table for her wine, I noticed the faintest scratch on her wrist, thin and red, like it came from a struggle. Our eyes met for a brief second. Hers flickered, then softened into that same perfect smile. I told myself not to panic. Liam would handle it. It was out of my hands now. But later that night, just as I was turning off the lights, the phone rang. Evelyn. Liam's voice was quieter now, colder. We found the suitcase. My heart stopped. He took a long breath before continuing. You need to come down here. I clutched the receiver, staring out the dark window towards Silverpine Lake, that mirror of secrets. The water outside was calm again, but inside me, everything had just begun to stir. The drive to the police station that morning felt longer than any I'd taken before. The fog over Silverpine hadn't lifted yet. It rolled across the highway like pale smoke, swallowing the pine trees and the road ahead. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every mile felt like a confession. When I arrived, Liam was waiting outside, his hat in his hands, eyes shadowed with something I couldn't read. The sight of his face made my stomach twist. He didn't greet me the way old friends do. No smile, no small talk, just a quiet, "Evelyn, come with me." He led me down a hallway that smelled of paper, coffee, and rain-soaked uniforms. Through a small window in the evidence room, I saw it, the suitcase. Black, wet, scuffed, still dripping faintly onto the tile floor. For a long moment, I couldn't move. It was the same one. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Liam, I whispered, please tell me it's not. He raised a hand, gently. We opened it. You need to brace yourself. He gestured toward a photo on the table, not the contents themselves, but the pictures taken during the recovery. Inside the suitcase was a bundle wrapped in a tarp, dark and soaked through. When the tarp was pulled back, it revealed something worse than I could have imagined. A man's belongings, a wallet, a cracked phone, papers stained with blood, and what looked like part of a torn jacket sleeve. The ID belonged to a man named Mark Benson, Liam said quietly. Used to live 2 towns over. We found traces of blood consistent with blunt force trauma. We're running DNA, but it's clear someone wanted him gone. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were leaning in. Mark Benson, I repeated, trying to place the name. It sounded familiar, like a word I'd heard in passing. Liam nodded. He worked at the same accounting firm as your daughter-in-law. They left within months of each other. My knees went weak. I reached for the edge of the table. Dear Lord. He placed a comforting hand on my arm. Evelyn, we're not jumping to conclusions. But if Sophie knew this man, it's possible she's involved, or at least knows more than she's saying. The words Sophie's involved rang in my head like a church bell. I wanted to deny it, to tell him Sophie was too gentle, too graceful, too good to do something like that. But then I remembered the scratch on her wrist, the weight of that suitcase, the way she looked over her shoulder at the lake, like someone running from their own reflection. What will happen next? I asked, my voice shaking. We'll question her soon, Liam said. But Evelyn will need Daniel to cooperate too. He could be a witness. At that moment, my heart broke in two, because I realized what I had done. I hadn't just reported a crime. I had set in motion something that could destroy my son's world. When I left the station, the rain had started again, soft, persistent, like the lake itself was weeping. I drove home in silence. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. Sophie's car was already in the driveway when I arrived. She was in the kitchen, humming to herself, slicing apples for pie. She looked up, smiling. "Oh, Mom, I was just about to call you. I thought we could bake something sweet today." Her hands moved gracefully, but for a brief second, her eyes flicked toward my rain-soaked coat, and I knew. She knew I'd gone to the police. That evening, after Daniel returned home, I watched the two of them sitting side by side on the couch, her hand resting gently on his knee, her laughter warm and easy. But behind that smile, I saw something else, a quiet calculation, a tightening of control. And for the first time, I was truly afraid, not just for myself, but for my son. Because the truth inside that suitcase had only begun to surface. And I feared that before it was over, the lake might not be the only thing claiming silence in this town. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my husband's armchair by the window, the house dim except for the faint glow of the streetlight spilling across the floor. The rain had stopped, but droplets still clung to the glass, trembling in the wind, tiny, silent truths refusing to fall. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that suitcase. I saw Liam's face, and Sophie's calm, careful smile when she asked if I wanted more pie. The silence inside the house felt heavier than the storm outside. For years, I'd told myself that silence was a kind of love, that staying quiet kept peace in the family, that some things were better left unsaid. But tonight, silence felt like betrayal. I thought of Daniel sleeping upstairs, trusting that the world around him was still safe. Trusting me. I went to the mantel and picked up a photograph. Daniel at 10 years old, standing beside his father, both smiling with their fishing poles at Silver Pine Lake. My husband's eyes seemed to look right through me, as if asking a question I didn't want to answer. "Evie," I could almost hear him say, "you can't save him by lying to him." A tear slid down my cheek, warm against the chill of the night. I whispered into the empty room, "But if I tell him, I'll lose him." The clock ticked softly, each second like a heartbeat I didn't want to count. I walked to the window again. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, calm, reflective, the same lake that had once been Daniel's playground, now a grave of someone's secret. For a moment, I wished I could turn back time, to before the suitcase, before the suspicion, before love had to share space with fear. But there are no such miracles for mothers, only choices. And I knew, deep down, that I'd already made mine the night I called Liam. Outside, a single drop of rain slid down the glass, leaving a clear trail through the fog. I followed it with my eyes and whispered, "Let truth fall where it must. I'll carry the rest." Then I turned off the light, climbed the stairs, and opened Daniel's door just enough to see him sleeping, peaceful, unaware. I smiled through tears. Because sometimes, being a mother means breaking your own heart to save your child's. The next morning, the sun rose behind a veil of fog, turning the world into shades of gray. The light coming through the kitchen window felt colder than usual, as if the house itself knew what was coming. Daniel hadn't spoken much since breakfast. He just sat at the table, stirring his coffee, his eyes lost somewhere far away. The phone call had come earlier, a detective asking him to come down to the station to clarify a few details. He'd looked at me after hanging up, confusion clouding his face. "Mom, why would they want to talk to me?" I couldn't answer. My throat tightened. "Just go, sweetheart," I said softly. "It's probably routine." But we both knew it wasn't. Sophie had gone pale when he told her about the call. For a second, her composure cracked, a flicker of fear before she forced a smile. "It's probably a misunderstanding," she said, her hand trembling as she reached for her cup. "I'll come with you." When they left, The silence that followed was unbearable. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock, counting every tick. 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2. Finally, around noon, Daniel came home alone. His face was ashen, his steps unsteady. I stood up immediately. "Daniel? What happened?" He sank into a chair, buried his face in his hands. His voice came out rough, cracked. "They showed me pictures, Mom. They said Sophie knew that man, Mark Benson. She'd been sending him money. Thousands of dollars." He looked up at me, eyes red and hollow. "They showed me the messages too. She told him she was scared, that I'd find out. She called him her escape plan." The words hit me like a knife. Not because of Sophie, but because of the quiet way Daniel said them. Not angry, not shouting. Just broken. He stood up and began pacing, running both hands through his hair. "You know what hurts the most, Mom? Not that she lied. It's that she smiled at me every day while doing it." I wanted to reach for him, to say something, anything, but words are useless in front of that kind of pain. He walked to the window, staring out at the lake barely visible through the fog. "Do you remember when Dad used to bring us fishing here?" he said quietly. "He told me once that water can look calm, but still pull you under if you're not careful." I nodded, my throat tight. He was right. Daniel's reflection flickered against the glass. A man who looked like my son, yet older, heavier, emptied out by grief. "I think," he whispered, "I've been living underwater for years without realizing it." Then he turned toward me, and for the first time since the call, he began to cry, silent, trembling tears that said everything words couldn't. I felt my chest tighten. "Oh, Daniel." He shook his head violently. "They think she killed him. They said she confessed to meeting him the night he disappeared. But she told them it was just an argument." His voice broke. I don't know what to believe anymore. I wanted to hold him the way I used to when he was a child, when scraped knees and broken toys were the worst things in his world. But he wasn't that boy anymore. This pain was too big for bandages or lullabies. "She wouldn't do that," he whispered. "She can't. She's not capable of something like that." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him already knew the truth, the same way I had known the first night I saw that suitcase sink beneath the moonlight. "Daniel," I said gently, taking his hand, "sometimes love blinds us to the danger we live with. But that doesn't mean you failed. You only loved too deeply." He looked at me then, his eyes wet and hollow. "I just wanted a family, Mom. A home. I thought she was my safe place." A tear slipped down my cheek. "We all want that, darling. But sometimes the home we build sits on borrowed ground." He leaned into me, his shoulders shaking. And for the first time in years, I held my grown son in my arms, not as a man, not as the husband of someone else, but as my little boy again, lost and hurting. Outside, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I turned toward the window. A black and white police car had stopped at the end of the drive. Sophie stepped out, escorted by 2 officers. Her face was pale, her wrists bound. Even from where I stood, I could see she wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry, cold, almost defiant. Daniel froze. He whispered her name once, then again, but she didn't look at him. She just walked past the porch and into the waiting car. As the door closed, I heard the faint click of the handcuffs, a sound that would echo in my mind for a long time. I turned to my son, my heart breaking. "It's over now," I said softly. "But the healing, that will take time." And as the police car disappeared down the road, I realized that truth, no matter how righteous, always takes something from you when it arrives. The courthouse in Silverpine was small, an old brick building with a white clock tower that had stopped working years ago. On the morning of the trial, the air was cold enough to sting. I sat in the second row, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching as Sophie was led inside. She wore a beige sweater, her hair tied neatly, her face calm as stone. It had been 6 months since the day she was arrested. 6 long, quiet months where Daniel barely spoke and the lake froze twice over. Sometimes, I caught him sitting at the window, staring out into the snow, as if trying to remember what warmth used to feel like. Now, as Sophie took her seat at the defense table, I felt the weight of every choice that led us here. The night I made the call, the look in her eyes when the police came, the silence that followed. The prosecutor stood first, his voice sharp, rehearsed. He spoke of evidence, the transfers from Sophie's account to Mark Benson's, the phone records, the DNA found inside the suitcase. He painted a picture of greed, fear, and desperation, of a woman cornered by her own lies. When the prosecutor finished, there was a long silence. You could almost hear the snow falling outside, soft, slow, inevitable. Then the defense attorney rose, his voice low and measured. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a story of evil. It is a story of fear, of a woman who made one terrible choice and then couldn't undo it. He paused, glancing at Sophie, who sat motionless. My client was desperate. She was being blackmailed. She wanted to protect her marriage, not destroy it. I watched Daniel's shoulders tense. His hand trembled against the bench. When the judge called for witness testimony, Daniel was asked to take the stand. He looked at me before walking up, a small, helpless glance, like a child asking for permission to breathe. The lawyer asked, "Mr. Grant, did your wife ever speak of Mr. Benson to you?" Daniel's voice was barely audible. "Once. She said he was a mistake she couldn't fix." He swallowed hard. But she never said how deep that mistake went. When they dismissed him, he walked past without looking at Sophie. She turned her head slightly, as if expecting him to say something. He didn't. And as I watched, I realized something I hadn't before. That love, when built on lies, doesn't collapse all at once. It dies slowly, in the spaces between words, until all that's left is silence. When it was the defense's turn, her lawyer stood and began to speak softly, almost pleadingly. "Sophie Grant is not a monster," he said. "She made a mistake, a terrible one, but she acted out of fear, not malice. Mark Benson threatened to expose her financial misconduct, to ruin her marriage, her life. She tried to stop him, and things got out of control." I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. His hands were clenched together, so tightly they trembled. Then Sophie spoke. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said. "We met by the lake to talk. He pushed me first. I hit him with a wrench once. He fell. I panicked. I thought I could fix it. I thought if no one found out, I could still have my life." Her words hung in the air like frost. The courtroom went silent except for the scratching of pens and the quiet, muffled sound of someone crying behind us. I looked at my son. He wasn't crying. He just sat there, eyes empty, staring at the woman he'd once promised forever to. When the verdict came, it felt like a whisper through a storm. Guilty of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. 25 years in prison. The gavel struck once. Sophie didn't flinch. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if his body had been holding its breath for months. After the hearing, I found him standing outside by the courthouse steps. The wind pulled at his coat, and for the first time in a long time, he looked small again, like the boy who once ran to me after losing his first baseball game. "She said she didn't mean to," he murmured, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you think she's telling the truth, Mom?" I hesitated. "Maybe she didn't mean to kill him," I said quietly. "But she meant to hide it. And that's the part that kills something inside you, the hiding. He nodded slowly, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. I just wish I could go back to before all of it. I reached for his hand. We all do, sweetheart. But life doesn't give us before, only after. And what we do with it. He turned to me then, his eyes tired but clearer than they'd been in months. I'll try, Mom, he said softly. I'll try. Behind us, the courthouse bell, broken for years, gave a sudden low groan, as if the wind had found its way into the gears. For a brief moment, it sounded like a heartbeat, and I thought, maybe that's what truth does. It breaks us. Then, slowly, it teaches us how to breathe again. A full year passed before I went back to Silverpine Lake. The seasons had turned over quietly, spring flowers, summer rain, and then autumn again, with its thin gold light and drifting leaves. The world moved on, as it always does. But inside me, time had slowed to something softer, smaller. Daniel had moved into a small apartment in town. He was seeing a therapist, going to church again. His smile hadn't fully returned, but sometimes, when the sunlight hit him just right, I could see the boy he used to be, a flicker of gentleness fighting its way through grief. That morning, I packed a thermos of coffee, a single lily, and walked the narrow trail that curved down toward the lake. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. Birds darted between branches, their songs distant and light. When I reached the dock, I stopped. The wood creaked beneath my shoes, just like it had that night. The night everything began. But now, the water was calm. The reflection of the clouds drifted slowly across its surface, so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. I unscrewed the thermos, poured a bit of coffee into the water, and whispered, "For the mornings we'll never have again." Then I placed the lily gently into the lake. The flower spun in slow circles before drifting away, carried by the faintest breeze. For a long while I just stood there, listening. The water lapped softly against the dock, like a heartbeat returning to rest. It struck me then how much of life is like this lake. People see the calm, the shimmer, the light, but beneath it lies everything we never say, our fears, our guilt, our secrets. Some sink forever. Some float back up when the time is right. I used to think truth destroyed families. Now I know it only destroys the lies that were never meant to last. As I turned to leave, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. I looked back once more at the still water, the rippling lily, and the reflection of the woman I had become. Not the grieving widow, not the fearful mother, but someone who had faced the darkness and learned to stand in the light again. I wasn't alone at the lake that morning. Daniel came, too, quietly, almost unsure whether he should. He carried a small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers we'd placed at his father's grave years ago. We stood side by side for a while, saying nothing. The air was still, and our breaths rose in faint clouds that drifted toward the water. "It feels different now," Daniel said softly. "Like the lake forgave us before we forgave ourselves." I smiled faintly. Maybe it did. It's been holding our secrets long enough. He knelt by the dock, set the lilies on the surface, and watched them drift away. For a moment, his reflection and mine rippled together, like two lives finally learning how to share silence without fear. "Do you ever think of her?" he asked after a while. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not the way she was at the end. The way she looked when you first brought her home. So full of life, so sure of the future. I pray she's found peace, wherever she is." He nodded, blinking against the morning light. "I think I finally understand, Mom. You didn't call the police because you wanted to ruin her life. You did it because you couldn't let me live in a lie." Tears filled my eyes. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to live in truth, even when it hurts." We stood there a little longer, the sound of water lapping gently at the shore. I could feel the years folding behind us, the pain, the silence, the guilt, all softening into something that no longer hurt, only existed. When we turned to leave, Daniel slipped his arm through mine, the way he used to when he was a boy. "You know," he said with a small, trembling smile, "Dad would have been proud of you." I looked up at the birch tree bending toward the water, the one my husband had planted the year Daniel was born. Its branches swayed gently, scattering pale leaves that floated down to join the lilies. "I hope so," I whispered. "Because I finally did what he asked of me. I kept our boy safe." When I reached the top of the path, I whispered one last time, "May peace rest here for all of us." And as I walked home, the lake behind me shimmered like glass, silent and whole. Because even in the quietest places, after the truth surfaces, the water can still become still again. Sometimes, life doesn't break in one loud moment. It cracks quietly, in the small silences between words, in the nights when someone you love becomes a stranger, in the calm surface of a lake that hides more than it reflects. Evelyn's story isn't about crime or punishment. It's about truth, how it can shatter, but also how it can set us free. She learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like loss. But loss, when met with honesty, becomes the first step toward peace. As we grow older, we learn that love cannot protect us from every storm, but it can teach us how to walk through the rain with grace. Evelyn didn't lose her son. She found a deeper bond through truth, forgiveness, and courage. And maybe that's what real love is. Not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that survives it. So tonight, if you find yourself staring into your own kind of lake, wondering what secrets lie beneath, remember Evelyn. Remember that the water can still grow calm again. Because sometimes peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from finally facing what you were afraid to see.